$18,900,000 disappeared from a building nobody could rob. No alarm went off, no lock was forced. No camera caught a stranger's face. When federal agents finally walked through what was left of the crime scene, the only sign that anything criminal had happened at all was an empty vault and 6 coils of rope left neatly coiled on the floor, like someone had cleaned up after themselves. That number, $18.9 million, still stands as the largest cash robbery in American history. Not bank heist, not jewelry theft, cash. Loose, unmarked, untraceable cash, carried out of a building that was supposed to be one of the most secure private facilities in the country. Federal auditors who later reviewed the depot's security specifications would call it, almost admiringly, one of the best defended cash facilities west of the Mississippi. That reputation is exactly what made the theft so hard to believe, and exactly what made it possible in the first place. This is the story of how that vault got opened, and how the FBI spent nearly 2 years chasing 6 men who had already blended back into ordinary life, driving ordinary cars, going to work at ordinary jobs, waiting for the money to go cold. It's also the story of the one mistake that none of them saw coming, a single strap of bills, still wrapped in the company's own security tape. The building was a Dunbar Armored depot at 1420 South Standard Avenue, tucked into the industrial flatlands south of downtown Los Angeles, California, between produce warehouses and rail spurs nobody paid attention to. Dunbar was one of the largest armored transport companies in the country, moving cash for banks, casinos, and retailers across the West. Its depots were built like small fortresses, reinforced walls, time-locked vault doors, multiple layers of camera coverage, a rotating shift structure designed so that no single employee ever had full visibility into the building's routines. The Standard Avenue facility processed cash for dozens of branches across the region, which meant its vault didn't hold a static amount of money so much as a rolling tide of it, swelling on certain nights of the week when multiple routes converged before redistribution the following morning. Security consultants who'd audited the depot years earlier had flagged exactly this kind of fluctuation as a risk, noting in an internal report that anyone who could predict the peak nights would effectively be looking at a map of the building's most valuable moments. Nobody flagged that the person best positioned to notice that pattern already worked there, already had the badge, and had every reason in the world to be standing in the vault room at any hour without raising a single question. The vault itself sat behind 18 inches of reinforced concrete and a time-delayed door that took 11 minutes to cycle open, even with the correct combination. A design meant to make brute force useless and patience the only real vulnerability. Motion sensors lined the corridor leading to the cash room, tied to a monitoring station that logged every entry within a tenth of a second. On paper, none of it had a flaw. In practice, every one of those safeguards depended entirely on trusting the people who already had the codes, the keys, and the badges to walk past them without triggering a single alert. On the night of September 12, 1997, that design failed completely because the man who understood it best was the one attacking it. Alan Pace III was 32 years old. He'd worked at Dunbar's Los Angeles depot for years, risen to a supervisory position on the vault floor, and earned the kind of trust that came with a badge, a set of keys, and unsupervised access to areas most employees never saw. He knew which cameras had blind spots. He knew when guards rotated shifts. He knew the exact half hour, almost every week, when the vault held its heaviest cash reserves and the fewest eyes were watching it. Colleagues who worked alongside Pace in the years before the robbery would later describe him, almost uniformly, as reliable, not flashy, not a complainer, the kind of supervisor who covered other people's shifts without making it a thing, who knew the names of the driver's kids, who seemed, by every outward measure, satisfied with a stable job in an industry most people never thought about. That reputation wasn't an act built for the robbery. It was years old, earned the ordinary way, which is exactly why it worked so well as cover once he decided to use it for something else. Nobody watches the guy who never gives anyone a reason to watch him. He'd also grown up in Linwood, a working-class city just south of Los Angeles, with a group of friends he'd known since childhood. 5 of them, men who trusted him completely and who Pace believed he could trust the same way back. That trust was the entire plan. Months before the robbery, Pace began quietly documenting the vault's routines. He photographed shift schedules. He sketched camera placements. He noted which doors stayed unlocked during shift changes and for how long. None of it looked suspicious on its own, because he was a supervisor doing supervisor things. Paperwork, walkthroughs, the mundane administrative motion of a man who belonged exactly where he was standing. What he was actually building was a blueprint. He timed the guard rotations across a full 6-week stretch, logging, almost obsessively, exactly how long the gap ran between the outgoing shift clocking off and the incoming shift settling into position. He noted that the depot's rear camera bank, the one covering the loading corridor, ran on a slightly delayed refresh cycle compared to the front-of-house system, a detail so minor that Dunbar's own security team had never flagged it as a liability. Pace flagged it immediately. It became the exact corridor his crew would use to move in and out of the building undetected. What he was actually building was a blueprint, and unlike a blueprint drawn by an outsider, his had no gaps in it, because every gap had already been walked through, in person, by a man wearing a company badge and carrying a company clipboard. By early September 1997, Pace had recruited 5 men from his old Linwood circle: Eugene Hill, Anthony Hackett, Christopher Calloway, Roland Moore, and a 6th man the crew simply called Ricky, brought in late for muscle and driving. None of them worked at Dunbar. None of them had criminal records serious enough to draw scrutiny. What they had was loyalty to Pace, and a willingness to trust a plan none of them could have executed without him. Eugene Hill had known Pace the longest of the group, going back to elementary school in Linwood, and by most accounts served as something close to a second-in-command during the planning stage, the one Pace trusted enough to walk through the timing sequence with, room by room, until Hill could recite it back without hesitation. Anthony Hackett worked steady construction jobs and brought a practical, hands-on competence to the plan, the kind of person who could look at a door and tell you exactly how it would behave under stress. Christopher Calloway and Roland Moore rounded out the core group, both men with families, both men who by every outward account were simply trying to get by on modest wages in a part of Los Angeles County that didn't offer many paths to $18.9 million honestly. The 6th man, the one the others called Ricky, was brought in closest to the date of the robbery itself, and would later turn out to be the loosest thread in the entire operation, the one member of the crew without the deep, decades-long history binding the other 5 together. He was recruited for a narrower purpose: driving, and physical presence if anything went wrong inside the depot. He knew less of the plan than the others, which made him more expendable in the moment, and, eventually, far harder for investigators to locate once the group scattered. In the final weeks before the robbery, the crew met twice at Pace's apartment. Using a folding table and a whiteboard, Pace erased completely after every session to walk through the sequence of movements they'd need on the night itself. He assigned roles the way a foreman assigns a job site: Hill on timing, watching a stopwatch, and calling out the minutes remaining in the shift change window. Hackett on the restraints, handling the tape and rope with the same practical efficiency he brought to a construction crew. Calloway and Moore on the vault floor itself, loading bags according to a weight limit Pace had calculated down to the pound, accounting for exactly how much 6 men could carry at a dead run without slowing down. Ricky stayed outside with the vehicle, engine running, watching the street for anything that didn't belong. They rehearsed the sequence, according to accounts later pieced together by investigators, more than a dozen times, until 31 minutes felt less like a deadline and more like a rhythm each man could keep without thinking about it. On the night of the 12th, the 6 men entered the depot during a shift change, the exact 30-minute window Pace had mapped for months. They wore coveralls close enough to Dunbar's own uniforms to pass a glance. They carried duct tape, rope, and confidence built on inside knowledge instead of force. There were no gunshots. There was barely a struggle. Employees on the floor were restrained quickly, quietly, methodically, following a script written by a man who knew exactly which employees would be present, exactly where they'd be standing, and exactly how long it would take backup shifts to notice anything was wrong. 2 of the employees restrained that night had worked the overnight shift at the depot for years, the kind of tenure that comes with knowing every hum and rattle a building makes after midnight. One, a father of 2 who'd taken the graveyard shift specifically because it paid a small differential he needed to cover his daughter's tuition, later told investigators he almost didn't come in that night at all, having considered swapping shifts with a coworker earlier that week. He'd decided against it because the coworker had asked for the following weekend off instead. It was the kind of small, forgettable scheduling decision that ends up mattering more in hindsight than it ever should have, and it put him on the vault floor at exactly the moment 6 men he didn't recognize walked through a door that should have been locked. One of the guards on shift that night, a woman who had worked the vault floor at Dunbar for nearly 6 years by that point, would later describe the moment differently than investigators expected. It wasn't the fear of the restraint itself that stayed with her. It was the calm. The men moving through the building didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They moved like they already knew exactly where everything was, exactly how much time they had, exactly which employee would be least able to trigger an alarm from where they stood. For weeks afterward, she told investigators, she found herself replaying the voices, trying to place one of them against someone she might have worked alongside for years without knowing it. She never did place Pace's voice among them that night, because Pace himself never set foot inside during the actual restraint. His role by that point was entirely logistical, orchestrating from a distance close enough to monitor but far enough to maintain deniability if anything went wrong. Inside the vault, the crew moved fast. Pace knew the layout of the cash reserves down to the pallet. Bundled bills, banded and shrink-wrapped, stacked according to denomination and destination. They didn't need to search. They didn't need to guess. They loaded what they could carry in the time they had, and at 3:47 in the morning, they walked back out through the same door they'd come in. Total time inside the vault, 31 minutes. Total cash removed, $18.9 million. By the time Dunbar's morning shift supervisor discovered the restrained employees and the stripped vault shelving, the 6 men were already gone, and so was any obvious trail leading to them. There was no broken lock to trace, no forced entry to analyze, no getaway vehicle abandoned at the scene with fingerprints inside. On paper, it looked like the work of a professional outside crew who had somehow beaten one of the most secure cash facilities on the West Coast. The FBI's Los Angeles field office opened its investigation within hours. Special agents fanned out across the depot, dusting for prints that wouldn't exist, reviewing camera footage that had conveniently gone dark in the exact rooms that mattered. It didn't take long for the lead investigators to reach an uncomfortable conclusion. This wasn't an outside job. Someone inside Dunbar had made this possible. That someone had already gone home, showered, and gone to bed like nothing had happened. Crime scene technicians spent nearly 18 hours processing the vault floor alone, photographing the shelving, cataloging every square inch of rope and tape left behind, swabbing surfaces for latent prints that ultimately matched nobody outside the building's own employee roster. The rope itself became an early point of fascination for investigators, precisely because it had been left behind at all. Professional crews with outside expertise typically carried their restraints back out with them, a small but telling habit that reduces physical evidence at a scene. Leaving 6 coils behind, neatly coiled rather than discarded in a panic, suggested people who weren't worried about evidence tying back to purchases they'd made under their own names, because they hadn't made any. Everything they'd used that night had been sourced anonymously, in cash, from ordinary hardware stores weeks in advance, according to receipts investigators would only piece together much later. For the first several weeks, the case moved on instinct more than evidence. Agents pulled personnel files. They cross-referenced shift schedules against the exact window of the robbery, narrowing down who could have known the vault's cash levels that specific night. Alan Pace's name surfaced early, simply because his job put him in a position to know everything the robbers clearly knew. But knowing and proving are different animals entirely, and Pace had an answer for every question they asked. He'd been off duty. He had no debts. He had no obvious motive beyond a supervisor's salary that, on its face, looked unremarkable. Agents brought Pace in for a formal interview less than a week after the robbery, a conversation that would later become something of a case study inside the Bureau for how a suspect could survive direct scrutiny with almost nothing but composure. He answered every question without hesitation. He walked investigators through his shift history without prompting. He offered, unasked, to provide his personal financial records, a gesture that struck at least one agent in the room as either the behavior of an innocent man with nothing to hide, or the behavior of a man who had spent months preparing for exactly this conversation. Pace's bank statements, when they came back, showed nothing unusual. No large deposits, no irregular withdrawals. He hadn't touched $1 of the stolen money yet, and wouldn't for some time, a discipline that would end up being the single hardest thing for investigators to break through. Weeks stretched into months. The trail that should have led somewhere led nowhere. One detail kept nagging at investigators from the earliest days of the case. A getaway route, hastily traced along surface streets away from the depot, had produced a single physical clue: A hand-drawn map, crude and unsigned, recovered from a spot along the crew's likely path out of the industrial district. Pen on notebook paper, turns marked with arrows, no names, no fingerprints usable enough to run a match against anyone in the system. It told agents almost nothing and everything at the same time. Somebody had planned this route in advance. Somebody had cared enough about the details to draw it out by hand rather than trust memory alone under pressure. That level of preparation didn't belong to a random opportunist. It belonged to someone who'd rehearsed. But a map with no name attached to it is just paper. Investigators spent the next several months chasing down every lead the map implied, cross-referencing intersections against known associates of Dunbar employees, running down anonymous tips that mostly went nowhere. The case, for all its scale, had gone quiet. $18.9 million, and federal agents had a piece of notebook paper and a hunch about a supervisor with a clean record. What they didn't know yet was that somewhere out there, a single strap of that stolen cash was still sitting in someone's hands, wrapped in the exact security tape Dunbar used to band its bills. And it wouldn't stay hidden forever. I spent a long time going through the way this case actually unfolded, and one detail kept pulling my attention more than the robbery itself. It wasn't the 31 minutes inside the vault. It was how ordinary everyone involved looked afterward. No yachts, no sudden disappearances to another country. Just 6 men trying, almost too hard, to look like nothing had changed. That restraint should have made them safer. Instead, it became its own kind of evidence, because restraint under that much money is nearly impossible to maintain for 2 straight years. And cracks don't need to be big to be visible if you're the one looking for them. Dunbar Armored, meanwhile, was reeling. The company's insurers were staring down one of the largest single payouts in the industry's history. Internal audits tightened across every depot in the network. Supervisors who'd once had broad, unsupervised access to vault schedules suddenly found themselves working under new dual verification protocols. A direct, expensive response to a robbery that had exposed exactly how much damage one trusted insider could do with nothing but knowledge and patience. Behind the scenes, Dunbar's leadership faced a harder question than any security consultant could answer for them. How do you rebuild trust with your own employees, the vast majority of whom had nothing to do with the robbery, while also acknowledging that the entire company had just learned it couldn't fully vouch for anyone wearing its uniform? Morale across the depot network dipped noticeably in the months after the robbery, according to internal memos later reviewed by investigators, with several longtime employees requesting transfers away from facilities they now associated with suspicion rather than stability. The company that had once prided itself on being one of the most trusted names in cash transport was, for the first time in its history, having to prove that trust all over again, one procedural change at a time. For the FBI, the case became something closer to an obsession within the Los Angeles field office. Agents built a task force specifically to track high-value cash movement across Southern California, watching for anything that resembled loose bills entering circulation in unusual patterns. Real estate purchases paid in unexplained lump sums, vehicle purchases with no financing paperwork, jewelry buys that didn't match a buyer's known income. It was slow, patient work, and for a long stretch, it produced almost nothing. The task force cross-referenced county property records, DMV filings, and jewelry retailer sales logs across a rolling 18-month window, building a database of cash transactions large enough to be flagged, but common enough, individually, to never draw attention on their own. It was the kind of work that doesn't make for dramatic television. Agents, combing through thousands of unremarkable filings, looking for the handful that didn't quite add up, knowing that somewhere in that pile was a thread that would eventually lead back to 6 specific names, if only they could isolate it from the noise of an entire county's worth of legitimate cash transactions. Then, in the spring of 1999, nearly a year and a half after the robbery, a business transaction in Los Angeles surfaced a detail that made an agent's pulse spike. A strap of currency, still banded, still wrapped in tamper-evident security tape, bearing Dunbar Armored's own markings, had passed through a cash transaction unrelated to the company entirely. Someone had used stolen money, still identifiably stolen, to pay for something ordinary. The tape traced back through Dunbar's internal batch records to a specific vault shipment. That shipment traced back to a specific date. That date was September 12, 1997, and the transaction that surfaced the bill traced, in a matter of days, straight back to Alan Pace. Suddenly, the case that had gone cold for nearly 2 years had a name attached to physical evidence instead of suspicion. Agents moved fast, but carefully. A single strap of marked cash wasn't enough on its own to guarantee a conviction against a man who had already survived one round of scrutiny with a clean story. They needed the whole structure behind him. The other 5 men, the money trail, the map, all of it, tied together into something a jury couldn't argue with. What's most surprising about this part of the case isn't the discovery of the bill itself. It's how ordinary the transaction was that exposed it. Not a police raid, not an informant flipping under pressure. Just money moving through the world the way money does, until it touched the one place someone was actually paying attention. Inside the FBI's evidence processing lab, the recovered strap became the physical anchor for everything that followed. A forensic accountant assigned to the case spent the better part of a week doing nothing but tracing the batch codes stamped into the security tape, matching serial sequences against Dunbar's internal shipment logs, a system the company had never expected to need for anything other than routine inventory reconciliation. Each strap of currency Dunbar processed carried a code identifying which depot had banded it, which shift had processed it, and roughly which date range it had moved through the vault. It was designed as an internal accounting safeguard, not a forensic tool, but it turned out to function as both. The accountant's report, when it finally landed on the lead agent's desk, didn't just confirm the strap had come from the September 12 shipment. It narrowed the batch down to a specific pallet position inside the vault, the exact stack Alan Pace would have needed to reach first, given how the vault floor had been arranged that week. That kind of granularity is rare in a robbery case nearly 2 years cold. It meant investigators weren't just looking at circumstantial proximity anymore. They were looking at a single physical object that could be placed, almost to the shelf, inside a vault on a specific night, and then placed again, nearly 2 years later, in a transaction connected to the one man who'd had a reason to know exactly where that shelf was. Agents began rebuilding the crew from the outside in. Payroll records from Pace's years at Dunbar showed exactly who he'd worked alongside, who he'd supervised, who might have had access to the schedules he'd photographed. Phone toll records, painstakingly subpoenaed and cross-referenced across nearly 2 years of call logs, revealed a tight, repeating cluster of numbers: Pace, Hill, Hackett, Calloway, Moore. The same names again and again, calling each other in bursts around the anniversary of the robbery, around the timing of large purchases, around moments that meant nothing on the surface and everything in context. Then came the map. Investigators went back to that crude, hand-drawn getaway route recovered in the immediate aftermath of the robbery, the one piece of physical evidence they'd never been able to attach to a name. Cross-referenced now against the residential addresses, known associates, and travel patterns of Pace's 5 accomplices, the geometry of that route lined up almost perfectly, with a path connecting 2 addresses tied directly to Eugene Hill and Christopher Calloway. A piece of paper that had sat in an evidence locker for nearly 2 years suddenly had a signature on it, even though no one had ever signed it. There was an obstacle here that almost stalled the entire reconstruction. The phone toll records, spanning nearly 2 years and multiple carriers, existed across incompatible formats, some on paper printouts, some on early digital archives that weren't cross-searchable. An analyst assigned to the case spent nearly 3 straight weeks manually cross-referencing thousands of call records by hand, matching timestamps to known movements of each suspect, because no existing system could do it automatically. It was slow, unglamorous work, and without it, the case would have remained a strong theory instead of an evidentiary chain a prosecutor could actually use in court. By the time that cross-referencing was finished, agents weren't looking at a lone insider anymore. They were looking at a fully reconstructed conspiracy. 6 men, a documented planning window of at least 4 months, a getaway route drawn by hand, and now, a paper trail of spending that didn't match anyone's legitimate income. Here's the take that will probably not sit well with everyone watching this. Dunbar Armored's own security policies made this robbery almost inevitable, and the company's outrage after the fact rings a little hollow given how much unsupervised trust they'd placed in a single supervisor for years. Pace didn't need to hack anything or defeat some brilliant countermeasure. He needed a company willing to let one person know too much for too long without anyone checking. That's not a criminal mastermind story. That's a failure of institutional design that happened to have a criminal mastermind standing in the gap. What would you have done in Alan Pace's position? A trusted job, intimate knowledge of a system's every weakness, and 5 childhood friends willing to follow you into something you knew. Going in could never fully be undone. Would loyalty to old friends outweigh the risk? Would the math of $18 split 6 ways make the decision for you before you'd even finished thinking it through? Armed with the reconstructed conspiracy, agents moved toward arrests in the summer of 1999, but an unexpected complication threatened to unravel the timing of the entire operation. One of the 6 men, the crew's most recently recruited member, had left California months earlier, resurfacing under a different last name in Nevada, working a job that had nothing to do with his past. Agents nearly lost him entirely, and only a routine vehicle registration check, cross-referenced against known aliases pulled from earlier phone records, placed him in Las Vegas, in time to coordinate a simultaneous arrest before he could disappear again. Coordinating arrests across 2 states, timed to happen within hours of each other so no one could tip off the others, required a level of operational precision that stretched the Los Angeles field office's resources. Agents worked with federal partners in Nevada to synchronize the takedown, knowing that if even one arrest happened early, the rest of the crew could scatter, destroy evidence, or simply vanish into new identities, the way their 6th member nearly had. In the days leading up to the operation, surveillance teams quietly logged the daily movements of each of the 5 remaining Los Angeles-based suspects, confirming work schedules, vehicle patterns, and home addresses down to the hour, so that the arrest teams could move on all 5 simultaneously, without any window for a phone call to slip through between houses. Agents rehearsed the entry sequence for each location separately, accounting for the layout of every residence, the presence of family members who had no connection to the robbery, and the possibility that any one of the men, cornered after nearly 2 years of silence, might react unpredictably. Nobody wanted a second scene inside this case that looked anything like the first one. On the morning of the operation, teams moved on multiple addresses across Los Angeles County and one location outside Las Vegas, Nevada, within a coordinated 2-hour window. Alan Pace was taken into custody at his residence without incident. Eugene Hill and Anthony Hackett were arrested separately, each unaware the other had already been detained. Christopher Calloway and Roland Moore followed within the hour. The 6th man, tracked down through his Nevada vehicle registration, was arrested outside a job site in Clark County before he'd had any chance to hear what was happening back in California. It was over in less time than the robbery itself had taken to execute. Here's what this case really tells us about institutional trust. Companies build security around the assumption that threats come from outside. Locks, alarms, cameras pointed at doors and windows, all designed to keep strangers from getting in. What nobody in that era of armored transport had fully priced in was the risk sitting inside their own org chart, wearing a badge, filing paperwork, and quietly becoming the single point of failure the entire system depended on trusting. The physical evidence agents had assembled by the time of the arrests was extensive. The marked currency strap tracing directly back to the September 1997 vault shipment. Phone toll records spanning nearly 2 years, showing a consistent pattern of communication among all 6 men clustered around key dates. The hand-drawn map, its geometry now matched to known addresses, connected to 2 of the accomplices. Payroll and shift records, placing Pace in exact command of the information the robbery had required. And then there was the spending. Once agents subpoenaed financial records for all 6 men, the picture crystallized fast. A truck purchased in cash, a down payment on a home that didn't match any of the reported income on file, jewelry bought outright, no financing, no credit check, paid for the way people pay when they don't want a paper trail. Except every one of those transactions had left a paper trail anyway. In interviews following the arrests, investigators pressed each man individually, using the strength of the reconstructed case to pit their stories against each other. Under that pressure, the carefully maintained silence the crew had held for nearly 2 years began to fracture. The interview room sessions stretched across several days, conducted separately so that no suspect could coordinate an answer with another. Agents used a deliberate strategy, laying out portions of the evidence in a specific order designed to make each man believe the others had already talked. It was, in the words of one agent involved in the questioning, less about extracting a confession through pressure than about letting each suspect watch the walls of their own story collapse in real time, one piece of evidence at a time, until continuing to deny involvement stopped making rational sense, even to the person doing the denying. One accomplice, confronted first with the phone records showing dozens of calls clustered around the robbery's anniversary, insisted for nearly 2 hours that the calls meant nothing, that old friends simply talked often. It wasn't until agents produced the marked currency strap, laid flat on the table between them, that his account began to change. He asked, According to the interview transcript, how they'd found it. He was told the truth. It had surfaced entirely on its own, through an ordinary transaction, with no help from anyone inside the crew. That answer seemed to unsettle him more than any accusation could have. If the money itself could betray them without anyone talking, then 2 years of silence had bought them nothing at all. In a separate interview room down the hall, agents used a different approach entirely with Roland Moore, the quietest of the six by every account from those who'd known him growing up in Linwood. Rather than confront him with evidence outright, they let him talk, uninterrupted, about his life since the robbery, the modest apartment he'd rented under his own name, the entry-level job he'd taken and kept for nearly a year, despite having, on paper, no financial need to work at all. It was Moore himself, agents would later note, who first raised the subject of the money, unprompted, almost as if 2 years of silence had become a weight he was relieved to finally set down. He never implicated the others, beyond what the evidence already showed. He simply stopped denying his own part in it, and in doing so, confirmed the last piece of the sequence prosecutors needed to place all 6 men inside the same conspiracy, coordinated from the very first month of planning to the very last dollar spent. One accomplice, facing the weight of the phone records and the marked currency together, told investigators something that would end up quoted in the federal case file for years afterward. "Nobody thought it would ever come back to us. We thought the money was clean by the time anybody spent it." It wasn't. Dunbar's own security tape had made sure of that. But here's the layer of this case that most retellings skip entirely, because it complicates the tidy ending. Of the $18 million stolen that night, federal investigators recovered only a small fraction. The rest, spent in fragments over nearly 2 years, or hidden in ways that never surfaced, was effectively gone. The arrests closed the criminal case. They didn't close the financial one. To this day, the majority of that money has never been accounted for. That's the part of the story that doesn't resolve the way true crime stories are supposed to. The bad guys got caught. The money mostly didn't. The federal prosecution that followed brought all 6 men before a jury, with a case built almost entirely on the reconstruction work investigators had spent nearly 2 years assembling. Prosecutors laid out the timeline methodically. The 4 months of planning documented through photographed schedules and observed camera blind spots. The 31-minute execution window, the marked currency strap that had unraveled the silence, and the phone and financial records tying every man in the room to the conspiracy and to each other. The trial itself drew modest but steady media attention across Los Angeles, less for its violence, since there had been none, than for the sheer scale of the number at its center. Reporters seated in the gallery noted how unremarkable the 6 defendants looked in person, dressed in ordinary suits, sitting quietly, none of them matching the image of a criminal mastermind the case's dollar figure seemed to demand. That contrast, prosecutors would argue directly to the jury, was exactly the point. The robbery hadn't required men who looked dangerous. It had required 1 man who looked trustworthy, and 5 friends willing to believe he knew what he was doing. Defense attorneys tried to separate the accomplices from Pace, arguing that some of the 6 had played smaller roles and deserved lighter treatment. It was a reasonable strategy on paper. It ran directly into the wall of evidence prosecutors had built. Evidence that showed coordinated planning, coordinated execution, and coordinated silence for nearly 2 years afterward. A conspiracy doesn't require every member to have planned the operation. It requires them to have known what they were doing, and to have done it anyway. Alan Pace, as the architect of the robbery, and the man whose access had made it possible in the first place, received the most severe sentence of the 6, a lengthy federal prison term reflecting both his role in planning the operation and the scale of the theft itself. His 5 accomplices received sentences calibrated to their individual involvement, ranging from several years to well over a decade in federal custody. None of them walked away from that courtroom with anything resembling the life they'd tried to build with the money. Put yourself in the position of the Dunbar employees who were on shift that night, restrained and helpless while men they may have recognized, or at least trusted the company to have vetted, moved through a building they worked in every single day. That kind of violation doesn't show up in the financial totals. It shows up in every shift those employees worked afterward, wondering if the person standing next to them on the floor was exactly who they claimed to be. Would you have noticed the signs before it was too late? A supervisor asking slightly more questions than usual about shift schedules. A friend group suddenly a little too interested in exactly when the vault held its heaviest reserves. In hindsight, every detail looks obvious. In the moment, Inside a company that trusted its own people by design, none of it stood out at all. There's a detail in the case file that still sits strangely with me, even now. Investigators never definitively determined what happened to most of the $18.9 million. Not because they stopped looking, because money that thoroughly laundered through cash purchases, unreported transactions, and nearly 2 years of careful spending simply stops being traceable past a certain point. Somewhere in Los Angeles County, or somewhere far beyond it, a portion of that money is sitting in property, or vehicles, or accounts that were never connected back to September 12, 1997. The Dunbar heist reshaped how the armored transport industry thought about internal security almost overnight. Companies across the country began implementing stricter separation of duties protocols, ensuring no single employee could simultaneously access vault schedules, camera layouts, and cash reserve levels without oversight from at least one other party. Dual authorization requirements for vault access became standard practice at facilities that had previously trusted a single supervisor's badge. Rotating, unpredictable shift patterns replaced the kind of fixed, memorizable schedules that had made Pace's 4 months of preparation possible in the first place. Industry trade groups cited the case for years afterward in training materials distributed to armored transport supervisors nationwide, using it as the clearest available example of how insider knowledge, patiently gathered over months rather than seized in a single dramatic breach, posed a greater risk to cash handling facilities than almost any external threat security budgets had historically been built to defend against. Insurance underwriters serving the industry adjusted their risk models accordingly, and several major providers began requiring documented separation of duties audits as a condition of coverage renewal, a direct and lasting legacy of a single night in a Los Angeles depot. For the FBI, the case became a training reference, used for years afterward, studied specifically for how agents rebuilt an entire conspiracy from a single physical clue, a strap of marked currency that never should have surfaced at all. It demonstrated something that still holds true in financial crime investigations decades later. Perfect crimes rarely fail because of some dramatic mistake. They fail because money, eventually, has to move, and every movement leaves a trace for someone patient enough to look. Alan Pace served the bulk of his federal sentence before eventual release, decades removed from the man who'd once had unrestricted access to one of the most secure cash facilities on the West Coast. His 5 accomplices, scattered across their own sentences, rebuilt lives in the shadow of a robbery that had once made all 6 of them, briefly, unimaginably wealthy on paper, and had cost every one of them everything else in exchange. Is this justice served, or too little too late, given that most of the $18.9 million was never recovered and never will be? That's not a rhetorical question. It's genuinely one worth sitting with, because the criminal case closed cleanly, and the financial one never did, and both of those things happened at the exact same time, to the exact same crime. What started as the most anonymous, untraceable robbery in American history ended as a case study in exactly the opposite. 6 men who knew each other too well, trusted each other too completely, and left behind, without realizing it, a paper trail made of phone calls, spending habits, and one strap of cash that never should have left a bank vault in the first place. The map they drew by hand to escape the scene ended up being one of the very things that led investigators back to their door. We cut a few details from this story for length, including exactly how investigators matched that hand-drawn map to specific addresses years after the robbery. If you want the full breakdown of that piece of the case, drop a comment and we'll cover it properly in a follow-up. If this kind of case interests you, the FBI's long, patient investigations into cases like this one rarely get told in full anywhere else. Subscribe if you want more of these reconstructed start to finish, and let us know in the comments which case you'd want covered next.